The gate was tall, imposing, made of wrought iron. Behind it, an elegant celebration honored achievements, prestige, and polished speeches. On the outside stood an elderly black woman holding a simple box tied with a sky blue ribbon. Dressed in a faded floral dress and an old apron, she seemed invisible among the white smiles and crystal glasses. Her name wasn't on the guest list, but inside that box was something no list could predict. A secret kept for 2 decades, and a promise whispered in silence. The kind God hears even when the world stays quiet. She didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't try to force her way in. She just stood there steady, holding the cake like one holds a living memory. People passed by and whispered, unaware they were witnessing a story that could change everything. Because sometimes, what looks like a simple dessert is really a cry for help, wrapped in vanilla and faith. A folded note hidden in the batter. A letter written by someone who had lost everything, except hope. And a woman who never forgot what she saw that night. Or who saved her. No one knew that this woman, with tired eyes and a soft voice, had once been a refuge for another woman years ago. A woman who now led the school. A woman who built her life on silence, fear, and unspoken gratitude. But none of that would come to light until the box was opened, until the past decided to knock again, gently, but with enough force to stop time. And when it did, no one was ready. Not for what the letter said, not for who had written it. This isn't just a story about a cake. It's about scars that don't show in photos but shape entire destinies. About women who carry burdens quietly, while the world pretends not to see. It's about forgiveness, quiet faith, and gestures that seem small, but change everything. And about the reunion of 2 souls who never forgot, even when the world tried to erase the memory. What started as a simple recipe became a miracle wrapped in parchment paper. So get ready, because when that box is opened, you'll feel the weight of what was hidden inside. You'll remember the times someone saved you, or when you saved someone without even knowing it. You'll understand that heaven speaks in ways the world ignores, and that every pain has an address where healing begins. Sometimes, right in the heart of a simple cake, made by hands that buried what they loved most, but never stopped believing.
Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey.
The warm scent of vanilla filled the tiny kitchen like an old, familiar embrace. The walls, lined with worn white tiles, reflected the gentle light of late afternoon as Miss Ruth stirred the glaze with slow, tender movements. Her fingers, weathered by time and labor, spread the frosting lovingly over the already baked cake, as if cradling a living memory. On the table rested a black and white photograph, a smiling young woman with dreamy eyes and a light dress, standing beside an older woman holding her with steady arms. Ruth gazed at the picture as if listening to an ancient voice, one that had never stopped calling from within. She sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. In silence, she reached for a small sheet of paper, folded 3 times, its edges yellowed with age. It wasn't a recipe nor a casual note. It was a seed. Written there in faded blue ink was something even she couldn't read without her heart tightening. Carefully, she wrapped the note in thin plastic, then in parchment paper, and placed it inside a small cavity she had made in the now cooled cake. She covered it again with white frosting, as if stitching a wound without leaving a scar. Beside the stove, her weathered Bible lay open to Psalm 126. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Ruth ran her hand over the page, then over the floral apron she had worn for years, and knelt before the turned-off oven. Holy Spirit, take this where it needs to go, she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't just faith. It was an old promise being fulfilled, quietly, without spotlights, the way she did everything. In that silent act, there was more courage than in 1,000 speeches, more hope than in 100 sermons. The box she placed the cake in was simple, sturdy paper wrapped with a soft sky blue ribbon. No label, no sender's name, just a single handwritten name, in small, almost shy letters at the bottom of the packaging. Miss Ruth Delaney. She looked at the box for a moment, before tying it closed with a firm knot. Her expression was serene, but her dark, deep eyes carried a weariness that had nothing to do with age. It was the weight of waiting, of a faith planted decades ago that might finally bloom. "It's time," she whispered, lifting the box, like one would lift a sacred relic. As she stepped outside, the Charleston sky was brushed with hues of gold and lilac. Ruth's slow steps echoed steadily against the wooden porch floor. Before locking the door, she turned for a brief moment, toward the empty chair, the photograph on the shelf, the folded handkerchief on the armchair no one else used. She nodded gently like one saying farewell to a sanctuary. "Today, she'll know," she whispered, and descended the steps like someone walking toward the end of a chapter, or perhaps the beginning of a reunion. Because that cake wasn't just a gift. It was an unwritten letter. It was pain turned into prayer, a scar turned into bread. And as Miss Ruth crossed the street with the box pressed tightly to her chest, no one, absolutely no one out there knew that inside that simple dessert was a memory wrapped in faith. Something time tried to erase, but that endured, stitched, between layers of silence and vanilla. The late morning sun was already casting long shadows by the time Miss Ruth arrived in front of Langston Academy. The sidewalk was wide, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and banners bearing the school's golden crest, swaying in the gentle breeze. She walked slowly, holding tightly to the paper box wrapped in a sky blue ribbon, her fingers slightly trembling, but her gaze unwavering. Ahead, a wrought iron gate stood tall like an imposing barrier, as elegant families arrived, in sleek black cars. Ruth took a deep breath. She was ready to deliver the cake, but before she could take 2 more steps, she was intercepted. "Excuse me, ma'am. Today's event is for guests with wristbands only," said a deep voice. It was Dean Wallace, the head of security. Black suit, dark sunglasses, chin held high, a man who treated control like a moral virtue. He looked Ruth up and down with the kind of expression that speaks louder than words. "Are you lost, ma'am? This isn't a place for drop-offs." Ruth didn't answer immediately. She pressed the box closer to her chest and shook her head with the same quiet dignity she'd learned since childhood. "I'm not lost, sir. I came to deliver this cake to the headmistress," she said softly but firmly. Wallace raised an eyebrow. "The headmistress? Do you have an appointment? Are you on the list?" Without waiting for a reply, he pulled a tablet from under his arm and began scrolling through names with a swipe of his finger. Delaney. "Nope, nothing here. You can leave it with the front desk if you want." But Ruth just shook her head again. It has to be her. It has to be handed directly to her. Wallace let out a short nasal laugh, barely audible but sharp. "Look, ma'am. With all due respect, we have a partner bakery for this sort of thing. If you're trying to sell cakes, there's a community fair down the hill," he said, opening the gate just wide enough for a family with 2 well-dressed children to pass through. The woman glanced at Ruth as if she were an out-of-place prop on a polished stage. "Next," Wallace called, returning to his post. Ruth didn't move. "Sir, please, just listen for a minute," she tried. But he raised his hand already, impatient. "We don't have a minute, ma'am. We run by rules, by lists, by order, and you are not on it." She stood there, frozen. The gate closed once more, and the world behind it drifted farther away. Inside the box, the cake still released its gentle aroma, but the sweetness of the gesture was beginning to mix with the bitterness of humiliation. Ruth lowered her eyes for a moment, as if speaking to God without saying a word. She was used. To close doors, to glances that passed through her as if she didn't exist. But this was different. Something greater was at stake. A promise. A memory. A story that only made sense if told to the end. And she wasn't about to stop here. The iron gate creaked shut completely, leaving Ruth on the outside, alone with her faith, her silence, and her box with the sky blue ribbon. In the distance, a child laughed. Someone made a toast, and the soft music of the ceremony drifted like a world she'd never been invited into. But she didn't turn away. She stood, still like a lighthouse in the face of a rising tide. Because this delivery wasn't protocol, it was destiny. Under the merciless midday sun, Miss Ruth stood firm before the towering wrought iron gate, which now felt more like an impenetrable wall. In the distance, she could hear soft laughter, muffled conversations, and the gentle clinking of glasses, toasting to life and success. It was all so near, yet as unreachable as a dream cut short. She adjusted the cake box in her arms, feeling the heat seep through the fabric of her floral dress, and closed her eyes for a moment, searching for strength in a place only she knew. Each second spent there was a stone thrown against her pride, each sideways glance a silent wound reopening in her soul. On the other side of the gate, a group of well-dressed women chatted in a closed circle, their words wrapped in polished, empty smiles. One of them, noticing Ruth standing there, whispered something under her breath. Behind expensive sunglasses, their eyes scanned Ruth's figure with a curiosity that held no compassion. "Who's that woman outside?" one of them asked, her brow slightly furrowed, as if Ruth's presence were a personal offense. Another woman shrugged, masking her disdain in faux politeness. "Probably some cleaning lady waiting to be let, and nothing important." Ruth heard it all. Not the words. The wind carried them away before they could reach her clearly. But the eyes. Those she heard loud and clear, the way they quickly looked away, yet lingered a second too long in. Silent judgment was a verdict all its own. She tightened her grip on the cake box as if it were a fragile shield, an anchor in a storm of quiet condemnation. It wasn't the first time she faced those kinds of looks, but today was different. Today, something far greater was at stake. From inside the gate, a young staff member in a navy blue uniform approached Ruth with a smile that faded the moment she saw her simple appearance. She glanced down at the tablet in her hand, then back at Ruth, shaking her head with a distant, dismissive expression. "Ma'am, there's no way to let you in without your name being on the official list. It might be best if you return home." Her voice was polite but impersonal, trained to sound respectful, yet hollow. Ruth nodded gently, without lifting her eyes, accepting the rejection with quiet dignity. But she wasn't leaving. Not now, as the hours crawled by. Ruth's calm expression began to show subtle signs of wear. Beads of sweat gathered on her wrinkled forehead, sliding silently into the fabric of her worn dress. Her breathing was steady but deeper, like someone fighting an invisible war no one else could see. Around her, the world continued untouched, lost in smiles, toasts, and shallow conversations. But within her, conviction remained untouched, glowing, faintly in the shadows of scorn. Finally, Ruth lifted her eyes to the clear blue sky, letting out a sigh of prayer only she could hear. It was a quiet plea, for strength, for patience, for faith. She didn't need to shout, argue, or force her way through. Her battles had always been fought in silence, with courage sown in solitude and hope stitched into the scars of the past. That's how Miss Ruth had endured every struggle before. Not with loud words, but with a silent and unbreakable determination strong enough to withstand even the cruelest silence behind proud, dismissive eyes. Inside the school, far from the well-lit halls and neatly arranged canapé trays, a young girl pressed her face against the glass window in the hallway. Her hair was braided with colorful ribbons, and her uniform was slightly wrinkled, like someone who had already run too much that morning. Her name was Lila, daughter of one of the janitorial staff, and she knew she wasn't exactly welcome in the main areas of the celebration. So she watched everything with the quiet focus of someone who lives on the edge of the spectacle. That's when she saw Miss Ruth, standing on the other side of the gate holding a box with a blue ribbon. The old woman seemed still, but something in her eyes made Lila furrow her brow. It wasn't sadness, and it wasn't anger. It was something else, a kind of stubborn hope she recognized because she'd seen it in her mother's eyes when she prayed softly before catching the morning bus. Lila looked around to make sure no one was watching, then ran through the empty corridors toward the side gate. She slipped past the hedges and called out, "Ma'am, what's in there?" Ruth turned slowly and smiled, the kind of smile only grandmothers know how to give, like a warm blanket on a cold night. "It's a gift, sweetheart," Ruth said, carefully kneeling to meet the girl at eye level. "But it's not for just anyone. It's for someone with an open heart. Someone who knows how to read what isn't written on the outside." Lila furrowed her brow, puzzled. "Is it a toy, or is it food?" Ruth chuckled softly. "It's just a cake, but there's a prayer inside. Only those who listen with their hearts will understand." The girl bit her lip, staring at the blue ribbon. "You want to give it to the principal, don't you?" Ruth nodded and her eyes glistened just a little. "Why didn't you leave then?" "People always leave when the security guy yells," Lila said with a child's brutal honesty. Ruth looked down for a moment. "Because sometimes when you promise something to God, you can't go back on it. And this cake, it's a promise." The girl stood in silence for a few seconds, taking in those words with the solemnity only children can have. Then she stood up, wiped her hands on her skirt, and said, "Wait here. I know the way to the principal's office." And before Ruth could say a word, Lila was already running back inside the school. Ruth followed her with her eyes. The lightness of her steps, her scraped knees, the innocent urgency of someone who truly believes anything is possible. She smiled, but there was a tightness in her chest. "Lord, if today is the day, let it be through her hands," she whispered, looking up at the sky, now slowly covered by soft clouds. A gentle breeze fluttered the ribbon on the box, like a silent nod of confirmation. Ruth's faith was never built on thunderous miracles, but on seeds sown into hardened soil, waiting for the right time to bloom. And maybe, just maybe, that little girl was the soil finally ready. Inside the school, Lila moved quickly through the hallways. Some people ignored her, others gave her a slight look of disapproval. But she didn't care. She had a mission. And deep down, something told her this wasn't just a cake, money was a key, a secret wrapped in vanilla and courage. She reached the door to the principal's office, hesitated for just a second, and then knocked. The sun was no longer high in the sky when Dean Wallace, noticing the girl's return and the activity near the gate, decided to intervene once more. He marched over with heavy steps to where Miss Ruth still stood, her shoulders now slightly more hunched, but the box still held firmly in her arms. "Ma'am, this has gone too far," he said, his voice louder than before. "You're making the guests uncomfortable, occupying space you're not allowed to, and causing a scene." Ruth didn't reply. She simply looked him in the eyes with a calmness that unsettled him more than any raised voice could. "It's just a cake, a gift for someone who needs it," she said, her voice low but full of conviction. Wallace scoffed. "No one needs cake here. We've got French catering, for God's sake. If you don't leave now, I'll have to call the police." The words landed like a stone. A few nearby guests paused to watch. A man in a suit approached, whispering something into Wallace's ear. Behind them, two white women looked on with thinly veiled disgust. One of them muttered, "Doesn't this woman know her place?" Ruth heard it, not with her ears, but with her whole being. It wasn't new. It was old. As old as the kind of wounds that no longer bleed but still ache. Still, she didn't reply. She didn't react. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, like someone inhaling deeply before stepping into cold water. A single tear formed but didn't fall. It remained, suspended between pride and pain. Inside her heart ached like it did the night her daughter left, without warning, without goodbye. It was in that silence of grief that the promise she now carried in that box was born. Dean, uncomfortable with her lack of response, raised his voice even more. "This is a private event. This isn't some street fair." But before he could continue, a teacher who had been watching stepped forward. She was young, blonde, her eyes full of hesitation. She looked at Ruth, then at Dean, and said with a wavering voice, "Are you really sure you want to keep yelling at an elderly woman in front of students over a cake?" A heavy silence followed. Dean hesitated. The teacher turned and walked back inside, but the tension remained. Someone had started to question the performance. Ruth stayed, her hands trembling, her back aching, her feet tingling inside her worn shoes. But she stayed, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because there was a pain still waiting to be redeemed. Something that could only be healed if that cake reached the right hands. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't leave. "If I give up now," she thought, "everything I planted with tears and will die in silence." And she couldn't bear to bury one more thing. Behind the school windows, someone was watching her closely. Eyes sharp, expression puzzled, heart racing. Because something about that woman stirred an old echo. A forgotten name. A memory that refused to fade. And while the voices outside slowly quieted, another voice, deep within someone who never expected to see her again, had just begun to rise. The silence inside Principal Angela Moore's office was broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner and the steady ticking of the wall clock. She was reviewing the list of honorees for the community event, names typed in a sterile, uniform font, sorted by last name and financial contribution. Her fingers glided across the mahogany desk with calculated grace. Angela had always kept her emotions tucked deep inside, as if too much feeling might shatter the image she had spent years carefully constructing. But in that moment, something unexpected cracked. A soft knock on the door. Before she could respond, Lila stepped in, her wide eyes full of urgency. "Principal, there's a lady outside. She sent this for you." Angela looked up, startled by the girl's informality. Lila held out the box, the blue ribbon slightly crushed but still intact. Angela furrowed her brow and stood slowly, as if the box carried weight beyond its size. When she read the name written discreetly on the bottom, Miss Ruth Delaney. Time stopped. Her face went pale, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. "You can leave it here." "Thank you, Lila," she said softly. The girl hesitated, as if she wanted to stay, but left. As soon as the door clicked shut, Angela collapsed into her chair. The name echoed in her mind like a distant bell, unmistakable and impossible to ignore. She ran a hand across her forehead, trying to convince herself it could be a coincidence. Miss Ruth Delaney. But it wasn't just a name. It was a whisper from the past, a breath from a place she had buried deep, afraid that unearthing it might unravel everything she'd built. Her eyes drifted to the box now resting on the desk. She didn't open it right away. She sat in silence, staring at that gift as if it were a message from the beyond. Something long dormant inside her stirred, uneasy. Memories came in flashes. A rainy night, a modest shelter, a woman in a floral dress saying, "You are not what he says you are. You are what God planted inside you." Angela squeezed her eyes shut. It couldn't be, but it was. She rose slowly, took the box with both hands, and walked down the hallway to the school's staff kitchen. Away from the eyes of parents and teachers, she needed solitude for what was coming. The fluorescent light flickered overhead as she set the box down on the white counter. Her hands trembled. It was like opening a time capsule she had buried herself. As she untied the ribbon, a familiar scent filled the air. Vanilla, a hint of cinnamon, and something from childhood she didn't even remember missing. The cake sat there, simple, delicate, but what made her chest tighten was what she sensed beneath the frosting. She knew it before she even saw it, because no one else knew about that letter. No one but her. She didn't slice the cake. Instead, she gently pushed aside the frosting with a small knife until she reached the plastic wrapping hidden in parchment paper. With hands that barely obeyed, she pulled out the bundle. And when she saw the fold, the faded ink, the unmistakable handwriting, she collapsed into the chair. It was hers. The letter she had written 20 years ago, the night she ran away. The paper she thought she'd left on a pillow and never saw again. But now, here it was, inside a cake, inside the very school she ran, as if God himself had waited for the exact moment to hand it back. Angela's hands rested on the paper, but it was as if time itself refused to let her open it right away. There was a weight there, not just emotional, but spiritual, ancestral, almost sacred. It was her life coming back to her in the form of trembling handwriting and faded blue ink. She looked around the school's small break room, which now felt like a silent altar. The world outside was still celebrating, but inside that room, time had stopped. It was just her, and the letter she had written at the height of her pain. Carefully, she unfolded the paper. The words leapt before her eyes like whispered screams. If this letter ever reaches you, it means my life was saved by a woman with no name. A woman with steady hands, a gentle voice, and unshakable faith. She told me that every pain hides a purpose, and that one day I would no longer run, but become a shelter for others. Angela covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back the tears. It was her handwriting, but it felt like it came from another woman. A woman who bled on the inside but survived because of someone she never forgot. Her heart raced like she was 20 again. She remembered that night, the frantic escape, her shaking hands as she wrote the note, the small suitcase hidden behind the couch, and most of all the smell of warm cake coming from Miss Ruth's humble kitchen. That woman had done more than offer shelter. She had seen Angela before Angela could see herself. She had prayed with her, sang softly to calm her sobs, and restored a courage Angela thought she had lost forever. Angela ran her fingers over the signature at the bottom, a shaky scribble. The date in the corner nearly faded. She had no idea how Miss Ruth had kept it all these years, or how she remembered her after so long. But now she understood. This wasn't coincidence. It was divine intention. The kind of reunion that only happens when heaven decides it's time to close a circle. And the principal, so used to being in control, suddenly felt small in the face of this quiet gesture, like she was a student again, receiving her first real lesson. At that moment, Dean Wallace's voice echoed through the halls. "Principal, Moore, we need you for the closing ceremony." But she didn't answer. She stayed seated, holding the letter tightly, like someone clutching a map back home. Tears streamed down freely now. Not out of sorrow, but recognition, gratitude, and a kind of pain that was finally beginning to loosen its grip. Because that letter hidden inside a cake wasn't just a memory. It was a miracle wrapped in parchment paper. A bond between two wounded women, now reunited again. Angela stood with newfound purpose. She tucked the letter back carefully, picked up the box, now with the cake slightly cut, and took a deep breath. She was ready, not just to say thank you, but to tell the world that sometimes the greatest salvation comes wrapped in silence. Angela walked down the school hallway as if carrying a sacred secret. In her arms, the cake box, now open, revealed the slightly disturbed frosting and the space where the letter had once been hidden. Each step echoed on the wooden floor, as if the entire school were holding its breath. The laughter, speeches, and camera flashes in the main hall felt like they belonged to another world. She no longer saw guests or dignitaries, only memories. And among them, one night stood out like a wave ready to break. She was only 32 at the time, recently married to a powerful man who seemed charming in public and cruel behind closed doors. The bruises around her eyes were hidden beneath expensive concealer. Her hands trembled at the wheel. No one knew, no one asked. Until one afternoon, after he shoved her hard into the kitchen sink, Angela ran. Her heart pounding, she dialed a number scribbled on a forgotten slip of paper. A woman answered, a calm voice. Come, bring nothing but what your heart can still carry. And that's how she met Miss Ruth, the woman who offered her shelter without asking a single question. Angela stayed in Miss Ruth's modest home for just one night, but there, in that kitchen that smelled of cake, she learned what it meant to be seen without being judged. Miss Ruth didn't talk much. She simply served tea, handed her a Bible open to Psalm 27, and held her hand firmly when she couldn't stop shaking. At dawn, Angela left. She placed a letter on the table along with an old brooch. They never saw each other again. She never knew if the woman had read the note. But now, there she was, at the very school where Angela had become principal. With the same generous heart and the same saving silence, Angela paused at a window overlooking the back garden. Outside, Miss Ruth still sat on a wooden bench, the box in her arms, unaware of what had just happened. Her body looked fragile, but her soul was forged from pure steel. Angela pressed her forehead against the glass for a moment. She wept, then smiled, because she understood. That woman hadn't come back for glory or recognition. She had returned to fulfill a mission. To remind her who she was, where she came from, and why she had to keep being a refuge for others. She then descended the stairs and made her way toward the main hall. The letter was now tucked safely into the inner pocket of her blazer. But what she carried in her heart was even stronger. The certainty that this cake hadn't just been delivered, it had been destined. A message from the past, stitched with faith, wrapped in courage, and served at the exact right moment. And Miss Ruth, she was more than a visitor. She was the living answer to an old prayer. Langston Academy's grand hall was at the height of celebration. Warm lights hung from the Victorian ceiling, reflecting off crystal glasses and carefully trained smiles. A string quartet played softly in the background, and guests spoke in calm tones about achievements, legacies, and upcoming school investments. The dean was approaching the stage to deliver the closing remarks when Principal Angela Moore appeared at the center aisle, walking silently, the cake box in her hands. She looked out of place in that scene of orchestrated perfection, and because of that, every eye turned toward her. The voices slowly faded, like a quiet wind weaving through the chairs. Angela stepped onto the stage without asking permission. Her eyes were damp yet steady. She took a deep breath and approached the microphone. "Good afternoon," she said, softly but clearly. "I apologize for the interruption." The dean began to rise to whisper something to her, but she gently raised her hand and continued. "Today I was meant to close this ceremony with a list of formal recognitions, but someone is here today who isn't on any list. Not in the program, not in the halls of honor, but woven into my story." A heavy silence settled over the room. Angela lifted the box slightly. 20 years ago, I ran from my home on a cold night. I was scared, hurt, and hopeless. A woman I had never met took me in. She listened. She saw me. And she taught me that what we sow with tears, we may one day reap with gratitude. By now, a few people were standing trying to understand what was unfolding. Others looked uneasy, but misty eyes appeared all around the room. This woman is here today, sitting outside after being humiliated for bringing a cake. Dean Wallace, still standing by the door, froze. He felt the blood drain from his face. His once steady hands now searched his pockets as if looking for somewhere to hide his shame. Angela looked directly at him. She didn't ask for anything, didn't demand entry, didn't shout. She just waited, like she always has. Then she turned back to the audience. Today, this woman saved me a second time. The first was with a quiet act of kindness. The second, by reminding me of who I am. Her voice cracked, and who I was only fear. But she saw courage where I only saw pain. The applause began hesitantly, then grew quickly, like a wildfire of compassion spreading among gold chairs and evening gowns. Some people wept. Others looked down ashamed. Angela stepped down from the stage with firm steps, crossing the hall like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Dean tried to approach, but she passed him without a word. She opened the front doors and walked out, the golden afternoon sun now bathing the garden. And there, on the wooden bench, Miss Ruth still held the box, her eyes closed, her faith unshaken. Angela stood before her. She said nothing. She simply knelt, like one kneels before an altar. And there, in front of the gate that once excluded her, the tears came, not of pain, but of recognition. And Ruth, with a calm voice, simply whispered, "I knew there was still something left to harvest." The afternoon had already folded into shades of orange when Angela returned to the hall, hand in hand with Miss Ruth. The chatter stopped the moment the two crossed the threshold. There was no background music, no announcement, only the sound of footsteps. Footsteps of a woman who had walked invisible for decades and now finally seen. Ruth's shoulders were upright despite her visible fatigue. The cake box was no longer a rejected gift, but a symbol of memory, of faith, of a courage that gives without seeking applause. The crowd parted like a sea of confused and moved faces. Someone began to clap, then another, and another, until the entire hall was standing, applauding, not for the sweetness of the cake, but for the strength of the woman who brought it. Angela guided Miss Ruth to the stage. When they arrived, she gently handed her the microphone. Ruth hesitated. She looked out at the crowd with the serenity of someone who had seen much. Then in a soft but steady voice, she said, "I didn't come here for recognition. I came because I still believe that a simple act can change the course of a soul." She paused, breathed, then looked at the audience with warmth. "I pray while mixing the batter. I pray while the cake bakes. And I pray when I wrap it, because it's not just flour. It's prayer, it's memory, it's promise. I don't know who will eat it, but I know who sends it." Some bowed their heads. Others wiped quiet tears from their cheeks. "Today I was left outside, but God never left me. And if this cake touched someone, it's because he still has warm bread for hungry hearts." Angela stepped forward and hugged her tightly. "She fed my soul when no one else could," she said into the microphone. "And for that reason, Langston Academy will establish the Day of Quiet Gratitude in honor of all the Ruths who changed lives without the spotlight." The hall erupted in applause. And there, in the heart of the most prestigious school in the city, a woman in a floral dress and a worn apron was celebrated for being exactly who she had always been. A vessel of quiet, steady, living faith. Dean Wallace stood in the back, unable to move forward. His gaze was lost, not only in shame but in something deeper, a discomfort that only visits those who realize too late the value of someone they once dismissed. Miss Ruth saw him. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at him with compassion, like someone who forgives in silence, but never forgets the weight of what was denied. And when everyone had gone, Ruth left through the same door she had entered, but this time with a name remembered, a story honored, and the certainty that even the simplest acts, when done with love, have the power to nourish the world. She didn't ask for applause. She wasn't seeking recognition. Miss Ruth only wanted to fulfill a promise she made years ago, when everything still hurt. Her cake was never just a cake. It was a gesture stitched with prayer, a hug stretched across time. While others saw flour and sugar, God saw faith and scars transformed into surrender. Sometimes healing comes wrapped in simplicity. And on that day, heaven responded, not with thunder, but with something quieter, undeniable. Because when love insists, even the most closed gates eventually give in. Angela didn't just find the woman who saved her life. She found the version of herself she thought she had left behind. The frightened girl who ran away that night had become a strong leader, but only now understood where her strength truly came from. Miss Ruth never demanded anything, never exposed her. She simply delivered in silence what she had guarded so carefully all those years. And that was enough to heal. Sometimes God doesn't send lightning. He sends people the world overlooks, people no one notices, but who change everything. And Miss Ruth is one of those souls. Invisible to many, unforgettable to those she touched. That school would never be the same, and neither would the people who witnessed that moment. Maybe not everyone understood what truly happened in that hall, but many went home reflecting on the gestures they had dismissed, on the people they had ignored. Because true greatness isn't found in marble columns or VIP guest lists. It lives in the hands that heal in silence, in the words that don't need to be spoken to be understood, and in the eyes of those who keep loving, even after being forgotten. And you, who once gave you something simple, that carried an entire world inside, who have you left outside because they seemed too small for your standards? How many times has God tried to speak to you through a humble act, and you didn't notice? Maybe today is the day to open your eyes to those who go unseen, because what seems insignificant to the world might be the very tool heaven chose to reach you. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Sometimes all someone needs is a little faith, wrapped in silence.